Thanks for listening to High Education. I'm Amelia Day, lifetime educator and social justice activist recording from my studio apartment. Today we will be discussing empathy, how it relates to trauma-informed instruction, and how we can combat secondary trauma as educators.
What is empathy and what does it have to do with teaching?
According to Eisenberg and Liu, empathy is an affective response that stems from the apprehension or comprehension of another's emotional state or condition. So basically, empathy is the ability to comprehend on an emotional level what someone else might be feeling. And anytime you have an adult working with children, I think that there's going to be a larger probability that there's going to be empathy on the adult's part because we've all lived through childhood. So we're all going to feel some form of connection to that child. I think that's why a lot of teachers become teachers. We don't just want to teach, we want to be around children. We want to help them as much as we can to become the best versions of themselves as they can be. So, empathy is truly just the connection of your mind understanding what other people might feel. And I think there's something to be said about the number of teachers who feel empathy strongly. I think that you'll find that any person who's in the helping field, whether it's a therapist, a doctor, a teacher, a paraprofessional, they're going to have higher levels of empathy just because they're there to help others. They're there to serve. And I think that you have to be empathetic in order to do that. There's actually something called an empath, and it's kind of flimsy science, but I do believe that there are people out there who have higher degrees of empathy than others. And an empath not only has the positive qualities of empathy that affect them, but then they also have some negative effects from it. They get overwhelmed easily. Like, I know that I have a strong degree of empathy and I struggle in large crowds because I start to look at all of the people and think about their lives and realize that I'm never going to know each individual. And it's just a lot for me to comprehend. And so I start to struggle if I'm in the wrong mindset in a big crowd. Um, and so there is something called compassion fatigue, and I think we're going to focus on that quite a bit this episode. Compassion fatigue has a lot to do with empathy. As the name kind of sounds, it's the exhaustion that you start to feel from empathizing so strongly with people who are in hard situations. Doctors get it a lot. You hear about it, especially like if they're working with terminal patients or patients who are in a lot of pain. They start to kind of shield themselves from the empathy. They don't necessarily humanize or try to feel the experience of their patients any longer, because at a certain point, if you feel everything, you will burn out. That is what compassion fatigue is. And I think if you look at the number of teachers who are burning out currently, then you will realize that compassion fatigue is a direct result of working with students with trauma in their backgrounds, or working with students who are coming to us with mental or physical issues that are hurting them. And so that's why you have the teachers who you're like, do you even like kids? They probably loved kids when they first started, and now they're just exhausted. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the toll that teachers pay for their empathy.
How does empathy relate to trauma-informed instruction?
Last week, we talked about trauma-informed instruction and how the trauma that students feel affects them inside the classroom and what teachers can do to help our students who are living with trauma or who have trauma in their background. So this week, I want to focus on how it relates to empathy. I want to start from the student's perspective because there are a lot of different perspectives we can take when it comes to empathy and how it affects trauma informed instruction. So let's start with the student. Well, we know that students who are experiencing trauma are going to flip their lid often if they are put in situations where they feel unsafe. And that means that they're not going to be able to think rationally. They're not going to be great critical thinkers. We know that affects them adversely with their academics, but we didn't really talk about how it affects them socially. Um, when a student is in that unregulated state, when they're flipping their lid, and they do it often, their ability to empathize is probably going to be um, just hampered by the fact that they feel unsafe. How are you supposed to care about the friends around you? How are you supposed to worry about their feelings when no one is worrying about you or that's how you perceive your life? If you feel like your parents don't care or they're hurting you and that this teacher all they want you to do is work 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 and they're pushing you and your peers around you seem so happy but you're not going to feel that level of empathy that your peers who are coming from good homes are going to naturally feel. And that's why schools are starting to pick up the slack with this. We're actually teaching different methods for empathizing. Where if you look, there's a program called Class Dojo out there, and they have the Big Ideas series that they do, and it's like about 5 minute videos, and it actually teaches students how to see other people's perspectives. And I think that's really important in the classroom because how are you supposed to have a community, a positive environment in the classroom if you have 5 out of your 25 students who don't have the ability to feel empathy yet? And everyone has the ability to grow in their empathy. You're not born with a certain level of empathy abilities, and you will never be able to grow. I think a lot of times we think that way. I think we view emotional abilities as something that's out of our control, and that's not necessarily the case. It's just something that we have to practice at, just like we have to practice our academic skills. Now let's shift gears and think about teacher perspective with empathy. Anytime you are trying to build relationships with anyone, you're going to develop a sense of empathy with that person. And we know that in order to have our students succeed at the highest level possible, we have to have a good relationship with them. It reminds me of a TED talk I heard where they said kids don't learn from people they don't like. And so we have to develop that relationship with our students, and that's going to naturally increase our empathy for them. And so teachers are feeling the effects of trauma. They are here listening to the stories of their students. I was reading a case study about some pre service teachers in the Midwest who actually are listening to the stories. And as you develop relationships, with your students, you're going to hear more of the stories either from the students, from their parents, or from your colleagues. When you hear it from the student, that's the strongest effective level you're going to have, and you start to take on that trauma. That's called secondary trauma. Teachers will often give them consequences. And I don't think there's a lot of studies about it in the classroom, but there's a lot of studies on it for therapists. And because teachers are kind of taking on the role of therapists at times for their students, even though we're not trained to do that, we are doing it because that's kind of what is expected of us at this point. And so we start taking on that secondary trauma from the empathy. The more you empathize with someone, the stronger the secondary trauma is going to be. So, like, For example, I had a student in my classroom who, like, he had some extreme behaviors. Like, he would get very angry and he would throw things. He would crawl under the desks. He would make very odd sounding noises and almost animalistic. And I was just so flabbergasted. And I didn't have a high level of empathy for this student because I didn't understand his background. All I could see was that I was trying to build a relationship with him, and he was denying that relationship. And it took about 2 or 3 months of me trying everything I could, and then finally we had a, conference with the parents, to start working on an IEP for the child, and she mentioned the amount of trauma he had in his background. He witnessed his father's drug abuse. He was abused by his father, and his mother, instead of shielding him from that, continued to encourage the relationship between the father and the son just because she didn't want to be the person who took away her son's father. And so, I mean, she was in a tough situation. They all were. And so my level of empathy for that child went from very little to very high very quickly because I mean, there was sparks of joy in that child I could see. Sometimes it was malicious joy, but it was there. And I could see that he was intelligent, more intelligent than he was showing with his grades. And so I was like, "Oh my god, this child has gone through stuff." And so my empathy increased. And then he was diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder, which is strongly correlated to trauma. And that increased my empathy because I was able to see that his actions were oftentimes out of his control. We talked last episode about how when students act out, but students with trauma do not learn from punishment because we punish thinking that they're going to learn, oh, I don't want this to happen again. When I do this, I get punished. But we're under the assumption that they know of a better way to behave. And that's not the case with a lot of students who are coming to us with trauma. So, developing the empathy is something that happens very quickly if you have a good relationship with a student. And sometimes there's a block. And sometimes that block of empathy is with our students who need the most empathy. And it's either because we can't understand their behaviors, it's because we have compassion fatigue. If you have empathized deeply with so many students who have trauma, you will eventually shut it off. I think that's a survival mechanism in our brains. They're like, okay, we cannot survive feeling all of this all of the time. So you will turn it off. You'll disassociate. You'll um, just say, I don't want to feel this, so I'm only going to have a surface level relationship with my students. And we know that's not going to allow that student to grow as well as they can. One sided, like they have a very limited perspective as a student in trauma. So if you can rise to a higher level and see the situation for what it is and disengage your own feelings, which is so hard, but it's necessary to work with students with trauma. You have to disengage your own feelings without disengaging your empathy for that student. Maybe it's taking a step back and not trying to interact with that student on their level. We know that empathy has negative aspects for teachers, but I do want to point out that there are a lot of benefits for empathy with our students, especially the ones with trauma. If we are able to make an impact on that student's life, a positive impact, we are going to feel a lot of fulfillment as individuals. So, enjoying that relationship, seeing that even though there's challenges through their behaviors, there's going to be conflict in any relationship you have, especially if you're the one in authority over a student who does not feel safe with authority figures. We're actually going to talk more later in this episode about different strategies to not burn out. We're also going to talk about strategies for schools to help their teachers cope better with the compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. But before that, we're going to move into how trauma impacts teachers. So, not taking things personally is something that you can do to protect yourself when you're working with students.
What are some signs that a teacher should look out for to know that they are starting to burn out?
Teachers are people too. So, some teachers are going to have trauma in their background that increases their susceptibility to secondary trauma. I mean, if you look at it, the teachers who are working in low income schools where the population is a majority low socioeconomic status are going to be the teachers oftentimes who grew up in those type of situations themselves. So they are going to have trauma in their backgrounds. I think it's very few of us as humans who get out of childhood without trauma, as well as just like things happen in your life that are out of your control that are going to cause emotional distress for you. And that's not, you can't not really separate your personal traumas, your personal life from your professional life. They impact each other. And so there are signs to look out for that show that you are starting to burn out, that maybe you're trying to balance too much all at the same time, either because of the trauma that your students are feeling or triggering your past traumas, or something's happening in your personal life that makes it difficult for you to focus in the classroom. There's really no shame in realizing that we are human and we are not superheroes, even though there's all those memes saying teachers are superheroes and all of that. Like, I feel like that kind of forces teachers into a box that says the world views me as a superhero, so I have to live up to these expectations. And if I don't live up to these expectations, I am not worthy of this profession. And I think that type of pressure is not healthy. And teachers are already in a position where they feel the need to be the caregivers oftentimes, especially if you're working with elementary size students or students with special needs or students impacted with trauma, where we tend to take on more than the academic roles. We take on caregiver roles, trying to kind of make up for what some of our students are lacking. And so there are signs that you should look out for as a teacher, as a paraprofessional, as a volunteer, as an administrator that tell you that you are starting to burn out and you need to increase your self-care. These type of things I've been reading about include just maybe you're not sleeping enough or you are sleeping too much. That might be a sign that you're starting to feel some compassion fatigue or secondary trauma. Not taking care of yourself. So, a lot of times teachers will use their lunch breaks to catch up on work. I did that, and all of the years that I was a teacher, I never sat down for lunch, and I think that is a big factor in burning out for me. So just take your lunch, guys. Anyways, so not taking care of yourself is actually a sign of burnout, which is interesting because self care is a strategy to ensure that you do not burn out. And it's interesting to me that when we start to burn out, we do the opposite. Instead of starting to take care of ourselves more, we let go of that one first and start letting ourselves go. So maybe you're starting to pick up some bad habits, whether it's trying to cope using alcohol or another thing, or it could be simply that you're feeling just overwhelmed, anxiety, depression. These are all signs that you are starting to burn out and that you need to focus more on yourself. So, teachers, imagine that you have a plate and you can only put so much on that plate. What are you going to put on there first? Well, you have to put on that plate yourself first, because if you don't, then you're not going to be able to hold the plate no matter what. If you run out of energy, you're going to drop the plate. So you have to put whatever you need on the plate first, whether that's making sure you get an hour of outdoor time, you get a walk in, you listen to your favorite podcast, whatever it is that you need to put on there, that has to be priority number one. Otherwise, you will burn out. And then you can start adding on anything else on that plate until it's full. And then stop putting things on the plate once it's full. I know it's so hard, but sometimes you have to just walk away from the work. I know that as a teacher, your to do list is infinite and you're only able to cross off so much a day. And so it's so tempting to just put in an extra hour here in the morning or an extra hour there after school's over, trying to get caught up. Guess what, guys? The system is broken. You're never going to catch up, and it's not your fault. So don't let yourself burn out because the system isn't working. You need to put yourself as a priority if you are going to be able to help your students.
How can teachers become more resilient in the face of compassion fatigue and secondary trauma? What can schools do to help teachers?
So I heard on a podcast recently that you should never explain a problem without coming with a solution as well. And I love that because I know that when I came to my principal the last year I was teaching, explaining to her how overwhelmed I felt, she definitely showed compassion. She was like, I don't want you to burn out the first year we have you. And she definitely wanted to help, but she didn't necessarily know what I needed. And I didn't come to her with any solutions. So I left that meeting completely unsatisfied, feeling frustrated that nothing was going to be changed. So I want to say that if you are feeling burned out, you definitely need to go to your support system and explain to them what is happening. But and go with maybe one or two ideas of what could happen to change that. Maybe you just need um support. Maybe you need like an additional adult in there at a certain time. I know there was a 30-minute window where I was the only adult in the classroom. And during that 30-minute window, that was the hardest part for me. So if I could have just said, is there a parent volunteering in a different classroom who could pop into my room? They don't have to stay the whole time, but just come in. But at that point, I was so overwhelmed that I couldn't think of anything. I was just like, help me. So, as an administrator, then if they see that you're having problems, I think what they can do is come in and observe during your most unhappy part of your day and see what they could do to help. Maybe it's simple suggestions to something that you could fix or something that they could do to help you. But definitely talking to your support system is number one. Now, I think that a lot of teachers don't want to admit when they have a problem inside their classroom to their administrators. And sometimes that's the school's climate issue. And if you're really feeling like if you admit that you need help, that you're jeopardizing your job, then maybe that's not this right school for you. Because I know that I felt supported in both schools that I worked with. I definitely felt like there wasn't enough support in my second school, but it wasn't anything to do with the people there. It was just the limited resources we had, and they wanted to support me in any way that they could. So if you're not working in a supportive school, your burnout level is going to increase and there's going to be little that you can personally do to stop that. So getting yourself out of that environment might be the best step. And if that's not an option, then creating a committee that is focusing on the culture of your school, thinking of ways that you can encourage positive cultural changes inside the school. Maybe starting a book club to get to know the teachers around you so that way you know which ones you can go to when you need support. Maybe it's not the principal who's going to help you, maybe it's your co teacher, maybe it's just a different, maybe like I even had help from the janitor, guys. Like you can find people there who want to help. It's just getting to know the people around you. So that's one step to becoming more resilient, finding the people, finding the resources. Another step is making self care a priority. I kind of touched on this a little bit, but I want to be very specific in the techniques that could help you. Um, like during your lunch break, I don't know how you feel personally about what's best for you, but some ideas include a little bit of physical activity, getting up and going for a walk outside, getting some sunshine in. I am living on the Pacific side of things where it's very cloudy, and I was not getting enough sunshine, and that's actually a big factor. I've read in studies that just going outside can really help. Physical activity can help. If you're spiritual in any way, connecting with that, like saying a little prayer or sending out some good vibes, whatever it is that your personal beliefs are. And if you don't have that, then finding something that gives you positive energy. It doesn't have to be spiritual or religious related. It could be reading for 10 minutes a book that you find joy with. Just give yourself a little break during the school day. Now, obviously, that's not going to fix everything, but giving yourself those little spurts of endorphins throughout the day can be a lifesaver. Keep some healthy little snacks around. I know that I kept like trail mix that had a lot of chocolate in it, so that way it's good for me, but it also has that chocolate. Hey, that's really good for your mindset as well. Yoga, meditation, just self care. Um, and I think that some schools are starting to actually take this on, like pushing for teachers to take care of themselves more. And I love that. So if it's coming top down, that's even better. But if it's not, you need to take responsibility for yourself. My therapist always says no one's going to advocate for you harder than yourself. So if they see that you're not advocating for yourself, then why should they? So you need to make yourself a priority and do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Now, I want to take on the perspective from like a lot of teachers don't see the correlation between self care and the prevention of burnout, the prevention of secondary trauma effects and compassion fatigue. Um, I was reading a study about pre service teachers who are experiencing burnout already their junior and senior year from their internships and practicums with their student teaching. And they expressed frustration in this study that they were not seen as a priority in their own like education. The classes they were taking were not teaching them self-care strategies effectively. They were not addressing the personal burnout that they were feeling. And a lot of them felt either hopeful that when they got into the field, it wouldn't be as stressful because they wouldn't have school assignments to turn in. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I know that I definitely was responsible for a lot less as a student teacher compared to being a teacher. It was a different kind of stress, but I wouldn't say that becoming a teacher compared to a student teacher was less stressful. So I hope that they were not disappointed by that. The fact is that our educational programs that teach our teachers need to make self care a priority. I think honestly, it should be a class in and of itself for any profession because teachers are not the only ones who are overwhelmed with the expectations that they are given. It's teachers, it's doctors, it's nurses, it's any helping field, really, and probably all fields need this. But since my podcast is focusing on education more so, I tend to focus on that as well. But like if you're a parent volunteering inside the classroom, you're going to start probably feeling some compassion fatigue because you're going to start seeing what's happening to the peers of your child, and it's going to be disheartening to see that children are not being treated the way that they should. I think that education systems should take on more responsibility. Pre service and in service teachers should be given resources to learn the connection between self care and resiliency. Next episode, we plan to connect what we've talked about with trauma informed instruction and resiliency in teachers to best practices with distance learning. Listen in for some strategies for distance learning, whether you're a teacher, parent, or student. If you enjoyed what we talked about, be sure to like and subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts. Proceeds from this episode will be donated to Save the Children. You can learn more about how you can support us and what we talked about today by visiting us at highedpod.com.